Good evening, and welcome back to another quietly meandering installment of Boring History for Sleep, the only corner of YouTube where horned helmets are historically inaccurate, but drifting off halfway through the story is highly encouraged. Tonight, we'll be settling gently into the long-forgotten world of the Viking warriors, seafarers from the north who rose to both fame and infamy, only to eventually fade into bedtime folklore. Yes, those same Vikings whose names once echoed across stormy seas and frightened monks in lonely monasteries are now the subject of sleep stories murmured over a flickering screen. Progress of a sort. So, take a moment now. Loosen whatever modern garments you happen to be wearing, which are, one hopes, slightly more comfortable than a tunic of scratchy wool. Settle into your pillows, ideally more than a hay-stuffed sack. Adjust your blanket with the precision of a seasoned shipbuilder adjusting his sails. And if you find yourself appreciating this gentle recounting of pillage, plunder, and the passing of ages, well, consider quietly tapping that little subscribe button below. No need to make a fuss. Perhaps even give this video a sleepy thumbs up if the effort won't disturb your resting heart rate. And, as always, if you feel so inclined, leave a comment below with the time of night you're listening and where in the wide, drifting world you happen to be. It's always a curious thing to see where these stories travel, from one quiet room to another, far beyond the old Viking roots of long ago. And with that, let us begin. The rise of the Northmen. It did not begin with an explosion of sails upon the sea, or with the clang of sword against shield. No, like most things in history, it began slowly, with long winters, longer nights, salted fish, and entirely too many suns. You see, in the far northern lands of what we now call Scandinavia, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, life was dictated by the cold, by the rhythm of the seasons, and by a landscape that provided more stone than soil. Farming was possible, yes, but grudgingly so. The earth yielded barley and rye, cabbage and onions, perhaps a few hardy beans. Livestock was raised with great care, sheep, goats, a stubborn cow or two, though the long winters often thinned their numbers, and the salted meat of last season became the treasure of the next. And into this world came the sons. Many sons. Viking families, you see, were large, for reasons both practical and fatalistic. Infant mortality was high, and one never knew which child would survive a harsh winter or a poorly timed illness. So children were had, and had again, and as the years passed, the eldest inherited the farmstead, the fields, and the livestock, leaving the younger sons with options that could generously be described as limited. One might marry well, if one was lucky. One might join the household of a local lord, if one had connections. But for many restless young men, with little more than a stout heart, a wooden shield, and dreams of something more than tending sheep, well, there was always the sea. And what a sea it was. The North Sea, cold, grey, unpredictable, a vast and restless expanse that called to those who had the courage to listen. The coastline was jagged and unforgiving, but for the skilled boat builders of the north, it became a highway to possibility. You must picture it, a small coastal village, half buried in snowdrifts, smoke curling from low-roofed houses, the tang of salt in the air. Along the frozen shoreline, a group of men and boys work in the pale winter light, stripping bark, shaping planks, lashing ribs to keel. The scent of pine resin mingles with seaweed and damp wool. They build not heavy cargo ships, but long, narrow craft, swift, sleek, made for speed and shallow waters. Why? Because when you are a younger son with no land, no wealth, and no hope of inheritance, you might as well go looking for some. Across the sea, rumours drifted on the cold wind, of softer lands to the south, of undefended monasteries fat with gold, of trade routes waiting to be opened or exploited. It was not one great moment, nor a single grand decision. It was the slow accumulation of need, opportunity, and sheer restless ambition, until one day the longships slipped quietly from the fjords and into history. And so, from snowbound farms and restless ambitions, we drift now toward the water, to the longships themselves, the very heart of Viking expansion. You might think, with modern sensibilities, that launching a seafaring campaign would require careful logistical planning, proper charts, watertight barrels, perhaps even a snack or two for the journey. The Vikings approached matters somewhat differently. A longship, you see, was a marvel of elegant pragmatism, long, narrow, clinker-built, with overlapping planks secured by iron rivets. These vessels were designed for speed and versatility, not comfort. With a shallow draft, a Viking longship could slip up rivers as easily as it coursed across the open sea. It could be rowed or sailed, beached almost anywhere, and, crucially, escape with alarming speed when necessary. The crew, a mix of hardened warriors, younger hopefuls, and the occasional grizzled veteran who'd somehow survived more summers than seemed plausible. They gathered what provisions they could, smoked and salted fish, dried meat, hard bread resembling edible bricks, and ale, plenty of ale, as water storage was, let us say, imperfect. Sleeping arrangements were non-existent. One did not sleep on a Viking raid, not properly. One dozed occasionally, propped awkwardly against a shield or a coil of rope, while the ship rocked and pitched beneath a grey northern sky. Rain was frequent. Sores and rashes were inevitable. The smell, by all accounts, was considerable. Yet there was a certain pride in it. To be part of a longship's crew was to be part of something larger, a living, breathing extension of Norse ambition. Every oar pulled in rhythm, every sail trimmed to catch the wind. The sea itself became an ally, or an enemy, to be read, respected, and sometimes cursed under one's breath. The earliest raids were small, almost tentative. A few boats at first, hugging familiar coasts, testing the resolve of their southern neighbours. But when word spread that such ventures could yield gold, livestock, and the occasional terrified monk, well, participation increased dramatically. It is worth noting that the choice of targets was far from random. Early Viking raiders had an excellent sense for vulnerable locations, particularly monasteries, which tended to be both wealthy and lightly defended. The monks, of course, were deeply unprepared for the sudden arrival of bearded men with axes. One moment, they were copying holy texts in peaceful seclusion. The next, the air was filled with shouted Norse, the clash of blades, and the unfortunate collapse of the monastery door. It may seem barbaric to us now, but from the Viking perspective, it was simply practical. Why attack a castle when you could raid an undefended abbey? Why challenge a garrison when you could empty a village granary? For a younger son with no inheritance, plunder was not merely greed, it was survival. And so, with every successful raid, the longships returned heavier, with silver, with slaves, with tales of easy victories. And each time, more would-be warriors signed on for the next voyage. The Northmen were rising, not with the disciplined legions of Rome, nor with the orderly armies of later Europe, but with loose bands of ambitious men who saw the sea as both opportunity and escape. Of course, with greater success came greater challenges and more distant horizons. As the raiding parties grew bolder, they ventured beyond the familiar coasts, seeking richer targets and more fertile lands. And so we row, somewhat stiffly, our cloaks damp and our boots cold, into the curious matter of Viking fashion, because even a hardened Norse warrior had to wear something, and that something was often several somethings layered atop one another, held together by leather thongs, bronze brooches, and the sheer determination to stay marginally warmer than the North Sea wind allowed. Wool. That was the foundation of most Viking garments, thick, coarsely woven, and scratchy would be a generous word. The Viking wool tunic was less about comfort and more about basic survival, trapping a layer of warm, if slightly damp air against the skin. Underneath came linen, if one could afford it, softer, more breathable, and thus highly prized. But linen did not grow on Scandinavian trees. It required labour, trade, or occasional plunder. Trousers, woolen again, were fastened at the waist with a simple belt and occasionally bound below the knee with strips of cloth. Why? To prevent flapping in the wind, of course. A flapping trouser leg could catch on a shield or snag awkwardly during a ship landing, both of which were inconvenient ways to begin a raid. Footwear, leather boots, practical if somewhat leaky after extended use. The constant wetness of the northern climate meant that no Viking's feet were ever truly dry. Soggy socks, therefore, were a universal experience across the longships, and atop it all, the cloak. Heavy, woolen, clasped at the shoulder with a brooch. It served as blanket, rain shield, seat cushion, and, occasionally, impromptu sail cover. A well-made cloak was as valuable as a good sword. It also advertised one's status. Dyed fabric was a mark of wealth, and deep blues or reds caught the eye in an otherwise grey world. Helmets, contrary to popular myth, no horns. Those were a later invention of costume designers. Real Viking helmets were simple, functional, often conical in shape, made of iron or leather reinforced with metal bands. The goal was to deflect a blow, not win a fashion award. And jewellery, yes, even on a raider. Arm rings, neck torques, brooches. These were not just decorative, but acted as portable currency. A silver arm ring could be hacked into pieces and traded for goods, should the opportunity arise. But even layered in wool, wrapped in cloaks, and clinking faintly with silver, the life of a Viking warrior remained cold. Very cold. The North Sea winds were no respecters of fashion, and so around campfires and hearths, tales would be told, of distant lands, of easy loot, of warmer shores where cloaks were thinner and boots less damp. The longships, dark silhouettes against a pale dawn, would nose their way up quiet river mouths or slide ashore on wide, empty beaches. No fanfare, no formal declarations, just the sound of oars lifting and dripping, the occasional clink of mail or creak of leather. For many of the inhabitants of early medieval Europe, the first sign that something was amiss was not a sight, but a sound. Unfamiliar voices shouting in a harsh, lilting tongue, followed moments later by the alarming presence of tall figures in wool and iron, moving with unnerving purpose through streets that had known only the occasional tax collector or travelling monk. It is easy, from our distance, to picture these early Viking landings as chaotic affairs, swords flashing, fires spreading. But often they were methodical. Raiders preferred speed and efficiency, in and out, before defenders could organize, before word could spread. Targets were selected for their wealth and vulnerability. Monasteries, of course, were a favorite. Rich in silver plate and manuscript treasures, poorly defended, and home to men of peace rather than war. The image of the stoic monk raising his eyes from an illuminated text to see a group of axe-bearing strangers at the door. Well, it occurred more than once. Villages, too, could be lucrative, if less dramatically so. Grain, livestock, textiles, tools, all valuable when you lived by the sea and the seasons. Slaves, too, for Viking society, harsh though it was, included a well-developed system of slave-taking and trading. Captives might be ransomed, sold, or absorbed into households. It is important to remember that these were not random bands of marauders, at least not entirely. Many were seasoned warriors, men who knew the tides and river channels better than the villagers knew their own fields. They moved with practiced skill, aware that a slow raid was a doomed raid. And yet, despite the grim business of it all, there was a kind of rhythm to these early encounters. The crew would land, fan out, collect what they could, and return to the ship. If resistance arose, it was dealt with swiftly. If none, so much the better. The first wave of raiders carried simple expectations. Gold if they could find it, goods if not, and always the knowledge that a swift retreat was essential. For the longship, after all, was not merely transportation, it was escape. And escape they often did, vanishing back down the river or out to sea, leaving behind charred beams, empty storerooms, and a growing fear of sails on the horizon. It did not take long for the stories to spread, of fast ships from the north, of warriors who seemed impervious to cold and hunger, of villages emptied before noon. For the monks who survived, these tales filled hastily written chronicles, perhaps the first recorded PR campaign of Viking notoriety. But as the seasons passed and the raids continued, an evolution began. No longer content with hit-and-run forays, certain chieftains began to think larger, to imagine more than loot, to imagine land, settlements, power. We drift gently into the next chapter of this story, a time when oars slowed, longships lingered, and certain Northmen began to look at foreign coasts, not just with the eyes of raiders, but with the speculative gaze of future landlords. Because even the most hardened Viking warrior, after enough cold nights on the open sea and enough sour ale in the hold, might begin to consider the merits of a warm hearth and a plot of land, preferably one someone else had cleared and built upon first. It began with winter camps. Raiding, as exhilarating as it might be, was largely a seasonal affair. The North Sea was not kind to wooden hulls in the dead of winter. So, rather than risk ship and crew in icy storms, Viking bands began establishing temporary bases along the coasts of Britain, Ireland, and northern France. At first, these camps were simple affairs: tents, rough shelters, hastily fortified enclosures. But, as any house guest will tell you, the longer you stay somewhere, the more your belongings and ambitions begin to accumulate. What was a camp one winter might, by the next, sport timber halls, permanent docks, even fledgling marketplaces. And why not? The soil was often better than the rocky farms of Norway. The climate, though wet, was milder, and the locals, while understandably resentful, could sometimes be persuaded, through coin or cudgel, to tolerate the newcomers, if not exactly welcome them. Over time, these seasonal arrangements hardened into something more durable. Settlements like Dublin, York, then Jorvik, and parts of Normandy began as Viking encampments and evolved into thriving towns, Norse in origin, but increasingly blended with local culture. Of course, not every Viking welcomed this shift. For the die-hard raiders, who preferred the freedom of the sea and the thrill of a well-planned assault, the idea of settling down, raising crops, and negotiating trade tariffs must have seemed dreadfully dull. But for others, weary warriors, second sons with little inheritance, aging chieftains with an eye on legacy, the chance to claim land, establish a household, and perhaps even be remembered for something other than pillaging. Well, it had its appeal. With settlement came new roles and responsibilities. Ships required repair, fields needed tending, markets had to be organised, and, inevitably, disputes had to be settled, preferably with fewer axes involved than in previous Viking problem-solving sessions. Gradually, Norse leaders adapted. Some married local women, forging alliances through kinship as much as conquest. Children born of these unions grew up speaking both Norse and the local tongue, bridging cultures. Trade networks expanded. Silver, silk, and spices flowed in alongside grain and livestock. And while the longship raids never fully stopped, they diminished in frequency as more Norsemen found reasons to stay ashore. Some became merchants, others craftsmen, a few even church patrons, though one imagines the monks remained politely wary. And so the image of the Viking began to shift, from the lone axe-wielding raider to the shrewd landowner, the burly market trader, the occasionally grumpy but pragmatic village elder, a slower, steadier life, less drenched in glory, perhaps, but also less prone to sudden sword wounds. As we drift further along this sleepy river of Viking history, sails lowered and oars shipped, we find ourselves gliding gently into another transformation, one less concerned with conquest and more with conversion. Because while axes and longships had opened doors, sometimes quite literally, to new lands, it was the quiet persistence of priests, the shimmer of silver chalices, and the promise of an afterlife with far fewer swords that began to reshape the Viking world. In the earliest days, of course, Christianity and Norse paganism had met under less than cordial circumstances. Monasteries were favourite raiding targets precisely because they were wealthy and poorly defended. Holy books made poor shields, and monks were rarely armed. But over time, as Norse leaders settled and intermarried, and as the economics of trading began to outstrip the spoils of raiding, the appeal of aligning with Christian rulers and their markets grew steadily. A baptism, after all, could open doors. It could mean recognition by powerful kings, the right to trade in Christian ports, and even the occasional land grant, far more practical in some ways than another season at sea chasing skittish merchants. And so one by one, Viking chieftains approached the baptismal font. Not always, one suspects, with deep theological conviction. Though who are we to judge the sincerity of a warrior with a dripping beard and a slightly confused look in his eyes? The ceremonies themselves were sometimes grand affairs, attended by local nobility and the occasional bishop whose Latin chants may have been drowned out by the less pious commentary of assembled Norse onlookers. Gifts were exchanged, swords, cloaks, rings, and feasts held after, where ale flowed more freely than liturgical wine. But with baptism came responsibilities, new alliances to maintain, new expectations of behaviour, or at least fewer public sacrifices to Odin, and a slow weaving of Norse society into the Christian world. The old gods did not disappear overnight, of course. Thor's hammer still hung from many necks, and certain woodland shrines remained well visited. But over generations, as churches were built alongside longhouses and Norse children learned their prayers in Latin as well as Old Norse, the balance shifted. Clerics who once feared Viking sails now found Norse patrons funding new chapels. Raiders who once mocked crosses now crossed themselves, perhaps a little awkwardly, before battle. And the sagas of old heroes began to mingle with the lives of new saints. It is a curious thing, how a people known for their fearsome independence could so quietly integrate into the very world they once raided. But then, even the hardiest warrior ages, and sometimes it is simpler to trade wool and amber than blood and steel. And so the Viking world softened, not vanished, but changed. The longships still sailed, but more often for commerce than conquest. Towns thrived, kingdoms formed, and the age of sudden coastal terror faded slowly into legend. Now, as we drift deeper into the tapestry of this transformation, we might consider another shift, the role of Viking women in this changing society, their influence, their resilience, and the quiet power they wielded beneath the clamour of shields and swords. Without so much as a jolt of the oar or a clank of the shield, we drift into a quieter but no less formidable chapter in this saga, the lives of Viking women. For behind every burly seafarer with a long axe and questionable table manners stood wives, mothers, daughters, and widows whose daily resilience shaped the Viking world as much as any chieftain's raid. Unlike many of their medieval counterparts, Viking women held a curious mixture of rights and responsibilities. They could inherit property, manage households, run farms, and, if left widowed, hold considerable sway over estates. Marriages were contracts as much as unions, and though love may or may not have factored in, a shrewd Viking woman could negotiate her place with remarkable skill. Daily life was, of course, endlessly practical. Morning light would see them tending to livestock, weaving wool into the dense, warm cloth that swaddled both warrior and babe alike, and preparing the day's meals, porridge thickened with barley, salted fish, and, when fortune allowed, a cut of roast meat. They brewed ale, a central task in a society where water was not always the safest option, and oversaw the preservation of food for long winters and longer voyages. Their hands shaped the very fabric of the household, from the loom to the hearth to the careful mending of sails, destined once again for uncertain seas. In a world where absence was frequent, with husbands and sons away on raids or trade, these women kept the rhythms of life steady. And when word came that a ship had not returned or that a battle had gone poorly, it was often the women who faced the consequences with stoic resolve. They were also keepers of stories. Around smoky hearths, tales of gods and ancestors flowed from their tongues, ensuring that sagas survived long after bloodied swords were laid to rest. In this way, they shaped the identity of a people even as tides of faith and fortune shifted around them. In burials, too, their status was marked. Grave goods for noble women included fine jewellery, imported silks, and even ship burials in some cases, a testament to their importance in life and memory. For a society famed for its warriors, it was telling how deeply it honoured the matriarchs who sustained it. And as Christianity crept in, Viking women often stood at the vanguard of change, baptizing children, supporting churches, and balancing the old ways with the new, all while managing homes that increasingly resembled the settled farms of their Christian neighbours. Thus, through seasons of grain and hardship, through births and losses, through faiths old and new, Viking women anchored a world that might otherwise have drifted aimlessly from raid to raid. And so our longship of thought drifts onward, the oars barely skimming the surface now, toward the ships themselves. Once the symbols of terror on European coastlines, Viking vessels began to evolve along with the people who sailed them. For even the fiercest raiders cannot swing an axe forever, and there comes a time when cargo holds outweigh sword racks in usefulness. The Viking longship, as you may already know, was a marvel, sleek, shallow-drafted, swift in water both deep and shallow, crafted from overlapping planks of oak and riveted with iron. They seemed almost alive, bending with the waves rather than fighting them. In their heyday, these ships were designed for speed, to slip across the North Sea, up winding rivers, and onto distant shores with unsettling efficiency. Their crews needed little more than a patch of beach for a landing, and less time still to cause a stir in any monastery foolish enough to stockpile too much silver. But as the Viking world changed, as settlements grew and trade replaced raiding, the purpose of these ships began to shift. The design softened, so to speak. Cargo capacity mattered more than lightning-fast strikes. Shipbuilders adapted their craft, widening the hulls, reinforcing decks, and adjusting sails for steadier passage. Instead of warriors bristling with spears, one might find merchants and craftsmen aboard, ferrying wool cloaks, carved combs, amber beads, and furs from the cold forests of the north to the bustling markets of the continent. Silver still changed hands, but now through barter rather than blade. The rivers that once carried raiders inland now served as trade routes. The Volga, the Rhine, the Seine, waterways where ships of commerce became more familiar than ships of war. And in ports from Dublin to Novgorod, Norse traders became known for shrewd bargaining rather than bloodshed. Still, the sea was never without danger. Storms remained as fierce as any enemy, and pirates, some of them distant Norse cousins, still prowled the waves. But for many Viking sailors, the life of a merchant, though quieter, offered greater certainty than that of the raider. And so the great dragon-prowed ships, while still revered, became less common sights. Smaller, broader vessels took their place, workhorses of trade rather than stallions of battle. Yet the spirit of seamanship remained strong. Navigation by sun and stars, the reading of waves and winds, these skills passed on from generation to generation, ensuring that even in peace, the Vikings remained a people of the sea. Now, as our quiet voyage continues, perhaps it is time to look toward the lands themselves, to the settlements that sprang up in once conquered territories where Viking culture mingled with local ways, shaping the map of Europe in ways subtle and surprising. And so, the current carries us onward, from ship to shore, from salt to soil, toward the places where the Northmen did more than raid or trade. They settled. It is one thing to steal a monastery's gold. It is quite another to plant barley in its shadow. But as the Viking Age ripened, this is precisely what many Norse folk chose to do. From the green hills of Ireland to the river valleys of Normandy, Viking settlers laid down more than anchor. They laid down roots. Their settlements began, as so many things do, with a camp, a few longhouses, a stockade of timber, a strip of cleared land for grazing sheep or growing grain. At first, temporary, a place to rest between raids, perhaps. But then, why leave? The soil was rich. The winters were mild by northern standards. The neighbours, once properly terrified, could be traded with. And so, timber palisades gave way to stone walls. temporary lodgings to permanent homes. In Dublin, York, and along the coasts of France, new communities bloomed, not entirely Norse, not entirely native, but something in between. The languages blended. So did the fashions, the customs, even the cooking. And here, perhaps, we glimpse an odd truth of history. That which is taken by force is often kept by adaptation. In these towns, blacksmiths and carpenters found steady work. Women ran markets and tended hearths no longer at risk of sudden flight. Children grew up speaking more than one tongue, knowing the stories of both their Viking forebears and their new homelands. Laws followed, of course. In some places, the Norse brought their own, the thing or assembly where disputes were settled by debate, or, failing that, by trial of strength. In others, they adapted to local codes. Either way, the once wild raiders now found themselves entangled in the everyday business of property disputes, trade agreements, and the occasional scandal involving goats. Even religion began to shift. The old gods, Odin, Thor, Freya, still held sway in many homes. But Christianity crept in, sometimes by sword, sometimes by marriage, and sometimes because it simply came with useful trade connections. Churches rose beside longhouses, pagan charms hung alongside crosses, and life went on. By the late Viking age, many of these settlements had grown into significant towns. York, once known as Jorvik, bustled with merchants. Normandy, literally land of the Northmen, became a duchy of great political weight, and in these places the legacy of Viking enterprise persisted, in place names, in language, and in the quiet resilience of people who had once come to conquer and had stayed to farm. So here, amidst the shifting sands of time, we find the Norse not as shadowy raiders, but as builders of new worlds. A softer chapter, perhaps, but no less fascinating for its quiet strength. And if you are still awake, which truly would be quite the feat by now, our long meandering tale could easily press on, toward the gradual twilight of the Viking Age itself, a time when longships grew fewer, when kings grew stronger, and when the Northmen's wild, wind-swept chapter began at last to close. With scarcely a ripple, we drift further downstream, toward the gradual ebb of the Viking Age. Not with a crash of oars or clash of steel, but with the slow inevitability of change. Even the fiercest sea kings must, in the end, bow to time. By the close of the 10th century, the forces that once propelled the Vikings across Europe were beginning to fade. Kings and kingdoms, once fragmented and feeble, were growing stronger. Fortified towns rose along riverbanks once left open to swift raiders. Stone replaced wood in many a monastery wall, and more importantly, alliances shifted. Some Norse chieftains, ever the pragmatists, found it far more profitable to ally with continental powers than to fight them. Titles were granted, lands exchanged. A Viking lord might wake one morning a feared raider, and by sundown be the newly minted count of somewhere or other, pledged to a king who, until recently, was high on his list of potential loot sources. Meanwhile, the Christian Church expanded its influence, not just by edict, but through the quieter pressures of marriage, trade, and diplomacy. It became harder to justify the old ways when one's cousins were now abbots, or when one's wife had developed a keen interest in relics. The gods of Asgard, though not forgotten, began to recede, their great halls giving way to quieter chapels. Even in Scandinavia itself, the change was felt. Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, long lands of competing jarls and petty kings, began to centralize. Monarchs emerged who sought stability over endless war. Laws were codified, borders drawn, and with central authority came a dampening of the old raiding spirit. After all, it's difficult to maintain a fearsome reputation when your taxes are due and your king prefers peace treaties to plunder. And there were fewer targets as well. The easy spoils of earlier centuries had been harvested, the element of surprise long since lost. Now, a longship might be met not by fleeing peasants, but by well-armed militias, or worse, a royal fleet with orders to sink first and negotiate later. Gradually, the great voyages lessened. Not entirely, of course. Even as late as the 11th century, Norse adventurers could be found in the Mediterranean, in the Byzantine Empire, in distant Rus. But the age of open-ended conquest, of countless coastal raids, had passed. The longhouse gave way to the manor, the shield wall to the council chamber. And yet, the legacy remained. In place, names scattered across the British Isles, in the blended bloodlines of European nobility, in shipbuilding techniques, in language, and in tales told by Hearthlight of Odin's wisdom, Thor's hammer, and the bold seafarers who once shaped the fate of half a continent. And so, as our ship at last nears the quiet harbour of sleep, we find the Viking story not ended, but transformed, from saga to history, from raid to remembrance. If by some marvel your eyes remain open, well, the sea of history is vast, and there are always more tales adrift upon it. But for now, perhaps, it is time to furl the sails, stow the oars, and let the waves carry us softly toward rest. No great battles today, no thunder of longships, just life, as it was. Which is to say, chilly, fragrant, and occasionally damp. Picture this. It is not quite dawn. Outside, somewhere beyond the turf roof and smoke-darkened rafters of your longhouse, the fjord still holds a deep grey mist, and the air smells faintly of seaweed and last night's fish bones. Inside, well, it smells of a few other things. Things which we will not name too directly for the sake of your sleep. In the centre of the longhouse, the hearth glows faintly, banked coals rather than flame, offering just enough warmth to stop your extremities from freezing solid in the pre-dawn chill. You, noble farmer, warrior, craftsman of the north, are not in a bed exactly. Beds, as such, were rare luxuries. More likely, you are nestled in a makeshift nest of woolen blankets, rough-spun linen, and furs that have seen better seasons, many seasons ago. And around you, life stirs. The family stirs. Possibly, the livestock stirs as well. It is worth noting that the Viking longhouse was a marvel of practical design. If your primary design goal was to fit as many humans, animals, tools, and barrels of pickled herring as possible into a single dimly lit space. Privacy, none. Soundproofing, laughable. Odour control, absolutely not. Chickens roost in the beams above. A shaggy sheepdog noses through your furs in search of breakfast crumbs. In the corner, one or two goats, whose ability to sleep standing up is both impressive and unsettling, blink at you with the resigned patience of animals used to this particular chaos. They are, after all, your alarm clock, or one of them. Another is your eldest child, whose task it is to prod you with a stick until you get up and tend the hearth. Parenting in the Viking age being very much a team sport. And so begins your morning, groggy, slightly chilled, enveloped in the layered perfume of smoke, wool, damp leather, and goat. A smell so persistent it might follow you into the afterlife itself. Breakfast will come later. For now, there are chores to begin. And by chores, we mean endless, repetitive tasks that maintain the fine balance between survival and frost-bitten misery. First, the fire. You shuffle over, groaning softly. though not too loudly, as your grandmother is still asleep on the other side of the hearth, and she can throw a ladle with surprising accuracy. The coals must be stirred, new wood added carefully. It's an art form, really, one that keeps the longhouse from turning into an icebox, while also preventing the rafters from catching fire. A balance only learned through trial, error, and the occasional panicked bucket of water. Next, the animals. The goats will need to be milked. The chickens will need to be convinced to leave their roost and do something vaguely productive. The pigs, oh the pigs, will require their morning mash, accompanied by the kind of verbal encouragement that can only be described as sternly exasperated. And all this before you've had so much as a sip of mead or a bite of porridge. The day is long. The tasks are many. The goats are watching you. Again. And with that, we shuffle forward, out of the haze of morning goat smell and into the next small chapter of Viking life. Because once the chores are begun, you will need to consider your wardrobe. And that is another story. After the morning's tender rituals, fire coaxed reluctantly into life, goats placated, chickens herded with varying degrees of success, pigs fed amid much undignified squealing, it is mercifully time for breakfast, or what passes for breakfast here in your sturdy but underheated corner of the Viking world. Now you should temper your expectations. This is not the kind of breakfast that inspires odes or ballads. No soaring sagas have ever been written about flatbread or porridge. No skald has composed a stirring verse about salted fish. But, and here is the important part, you will not go hungry. Probably. The day's first meal is a quiet, communal affair, taken around the longhouse hearth. There is no dining table exactly. Rather, people settle themselves on benches or the edge of their sleeping areas, bowls in hand, spoons at the ready. The spoons may or may not match. The bowls certainly do not. Pottery here has a tendency to chip, crack, and otherwise develop character. In the central pot, simmering away over the reawakened coals, is the reliable staple of your existence. Porridge. Barley porridge, to be precise. It is thick, hearty, occasionally lumpy. It clings to your spoon and your ribs in equal measure. And while the porridge of the Viking age is not likely to win any modern culinary awards, it is dependable, like a stoic old relative who visits uninvited but always brings useful advice. Today's porridge is about average. There is a bit less weevil than usual, a small victory. The barley was well stored this season, and the cook, perhaps your mother, or perhaps a sharp-eyed aunt who takes no nonsense from vermin, has been vigilant with the grain. So you tuck in, grateful for small mercies. Accompanying this is flatbread. The flatbread is thin, crisp at the edges, and slightly smoky from having been baked on hot stones. If it was made yesterday, it might be a touch leathery. If it was made last week, you could probably use it to shingle the roof. Either way, you tear off pieces and dip them into the porridge with the slow, practiced motions of one who has done this 1,000 times and will do it 1,000 more. And then, the fish. Always the fish. Salted herring or dried cod, depending on the season and your proximity to the coast, makes its appearance in some form at nearly every meal. Today it is sliced thin, laid out on a wooden board, glistening slightly with oil and salt. It offers a bracing counterpoint to the bland porridge. Sharp, pungent, unapologetically fishy. You eat it because you need the protein, not because you particularly enjoy the experience. If fortune smiles upon you, if the summer harvest was kind, or a clever household member has been to market, you might also have onions. Not fresh, mind you. It is well past onion season. But stored ones, shriveled slightly, their outer layers peeled away to reveal a serviceable heart. These, when finely chopped and stirred into porridge or layered atop flatbread, provide a welcome note of sharpness. You eat them sparingly, knowing the supply must last the winter, and should the gods be truly generous, there might even be a smear of butter churned laboriously from the previous day's goat milk. The butter is yellowish, uneven in texture, and carries just the faintest hint of goat, but it is rich, and for a moment you allow yourself the indulgence. Conversation during this meal is muted. Mornings in the longhouse are about survival, not socializing. The fire cracks softly. The occasional thump of a goat head against a beam reminds you that the animals are awake too. Someone sneezes in the far corner, a sound magnified by the close wooden walls. You chew, you swallow, you repeat. There is work to be done, fields to tend, boats to repair, weapons to sharpen, and all of this begins after porridge. Having fortified yourself with porridge, fish, and perhaps a brave nibble of onion, you now face the next grand challenge of any respectable Viking morning, the art of getting dressed. To the untrained eye, this might seem straightforward. You rise, you pull on clothes, you proceed to go about your day. But for the average Norseman, or Norse woman, of the early medieval world, getting dressed was less a casual routine and more a strategic operation involving layers, fasteners, and an unspoken code of textile bravado. Firstly, one must address the base layer. Linen, when available, was the material of choice, woven from flax and bleached to a pale, serviceable hue. The shirt, long and loose, was the Viking equivalent of under armour. Protective, breathable, and, crucially, washable, which is more than can be said for some of the outer garments soon to follow. Next comes the wool, glorious, scratchy, abundant wool, spun, woven, and dyed with whatever local plants could be persuaded to surrender their pigment. Ochres, earthy reds, muddy greens, and muted blues were common, though the richness of your hue might quietly signal your household's prosperity or lack thereof. A tunic, perhaps knee-length for men, or longer for women, is pulled on over the linen. It hangs heavy with the weight of practical life, patches here and there from past repairs, perhaps a faint trace of last week's stew, a button or two replaced with bone toggles. It is not fashion-forward. It is simply forward, into another day of wear and tear. For the legs, trousers are the norm, crafted from sturdy wool and often bound at the calf with woven bands to keep the fabric in place. These leg wrappings, endlessly practical, have the added advantage of making your legs look somewhat more purposeful than they might otherwise appear in bulk wool. And now, the outer layer. A cloak or heavy over-tunic is draped across the shoulders, an indispensable garment for a land where the weather is eternally undecided. Fastened with an iron or bronze brooch, the larger and more elaborate, the better. The cloak serves as a shield against cold winds, sea spray, and the occasional clumsy goat. It also, intentionally or not, gives the wearer the vague air of someone prepared to attend a funeral or stage a raid, both distinct possibilities on any given day. Footwear is its own adventure. Soft leather shoes or boots, turned from supple hides and laced with patience, are pulled on with some effort. They are waterproof, in theory. In practice, a good pair of woolen socks is your true defense against damp toes and creeping frost. Accessories? Naturally. A belt hung with small tools, pouches, or perhaps a blade for utility as much as status. Arm rings of bronze or silver, worn not only for decoration but as portable wealth should the need to bribe or barter arise. And hair. Hair is a serious matter. long hair, often well kept, sometimes braided, for both men and women. It speaks of care, of pride, of social standing. And if you're heading out for a gathering, a bead or two threaded into a braid can announce your taste and rank better than any modern logo. Lastly, no Viking would feel fully dressed without a layer of intent, readiness for work, for weather, for warfare, and, should the sagas twist unfavourably, for death. The outfit is practical, but it is also armour for a world where life is harsh, unpredictable, and occasionally downright poetic in its misfortune. And so, fully clad, a figure of wool, linen, leather, and determined expression, you step out into the day. The cold bites less sharply through your layers. The brooch at your shoulder glints in the morning light. The goats, unimpressed as always, resume their ceaseless chewing. And from here, naturally, the day must proceed. The sea awaits, the forge smoulders, the fields call. But for those with a thirst for adventure, or an uncomfortable surplus of second sons, the next matter is ship maintenance. For what is a Viking without a boat? And what is a boat, if not constantly in need of repair? The majestic rectangle of practicality, communal bonding, and mild despair. The architectural marvel that said, what if we put everyone, everything, and every smell we own into one single room and just sort of dealt with it? It was the Viking answer to all things domestic, civic, and aromatic. A long timber-framed building with a gently sloping roof, often thatched with turf or straw, and designed with only one central philosophy in mind. Let's survive the winter and not freeze solid in our sleep. The longhouse was long, yes, the name is nothing if not brutally literal, but it wasn't particularly wide. Narrow enough to hear your cousin's digestive complaints at one end, while your grandmother told stories to goats at the other. Privacy was not just a luxury, it was a foreign concept, one that no one bothered to pursue unless you were a chieftain or a hermit with a death wish. Inside, the layout was as egalitarian as it was smoky. There was a central hearth, long, narrow, and perpetually smouldering, running down the middle of the building. This was the heart of the home, where cooking, warmth, light, and accidental tripping incidents all took place in cheerful synchrony. There was no chimney, of course. Why spoil the ambience? The smoke was left to rise and hover, politely hovering just below head height, giving everyone a shared sense of teary-eyed kinship and a cough that echoed across generations. Along either side of the hearth were raised platforms, benches by day, beds by night, layered with fur, straw, and perhaps the occasional flea circus. Here, entire families would sleep side by side, shoulder to shoulder, occasionally elbow to sternum, depending on whose elbows and sternums were involved. Babies cried, elders snored. Someone inevitably rolled off the edge and into the embers at least once a winter, and everyone acted surprised. And yes, animals. Chickens, goats, and even the occasional pig were welcome guests in this drafty dwelling. They added heat, companionship, and a constant background soundtrack of clucks, bleats, and snuffles, whether you wanted them there or not. You might imagine separating the livestock into their own quarters, and they did try with wooden partitions or a sort of psychological denial, but in the end, space was precious, warmth was a group effort, and the pig had been there longer than you. Personal belongings were kept in chests or hung from pegs on the walls, which were lined with wooden planks or woven wattle, insulated with moss or animal hair. The scent was a pungent bouquet of wet wool, wood smoke, onions, and varying degrees of unwashed humanity. a perfume the Vikings wore with remarkable pride, probably because they couldn't smell it anymore. Meals were shared communally, often eaten from the same bowl with spoons that had seen things no spoon should have to see. Conversation during meals varied. Stories, gossip, plans for voyages, or spirited debates over who last washed the communal eating knife. Answer: no one. There was laughter, music, the occasional argument, and a deep sense that no matter how many times someone stepped on your foot or mistook your blanket for theirs, this was home. Illness, of course, spread with the enthusiasm of a bard after 2 horns of mead. If one person caught a cold, the longhouse caught it with them, a cosy blanket of respiratory affliction wrapped snugly around the entire family. And there were no antibiotics, no tissues, no hand sanitizer, just strong tea, herbal poultices, and sheer Nordic stubbornness. And yet, there was warmth. There was light. There was togetherness. In the creaking timbers and flickering shadows, in the clatter of spoons and the wheeze of old warriors trying to clear their throats, there was something oddly comforting. The longhouse was less a structure than a communal shrug in the face of nature. And when the wind howled outside and the snow drifted knee-deep by the door, and someone's uncle was already snoring loud enough to make the rafters shiver, it meant you'd made it another night. Now, once your eyes adjust to the haze, and you've accepted that your neighbour's elbow is now part of your sleeping arrangement, you might hear talk of travel, a murmur about sails, about distant shores, about raids politely scheduled for warmer weather. And so, as the longhouse hums with the slow rhythm of another shared evening, we begin to drift toward the next reality of Viking life, training for battle. When not actively swinging an axe at someone else's livestock or debating the structural integrity of a monastery wall with fire, the average Viking was, in fact, shockingly domestic, or at least productively bored. Because even warriors need a day off, especially when the wind's howling sideways and the longships covered in ice. So what did one do in a world without Netflix, treadmills, or indoor plumbing? You carved things, endlessly, obsessively, with the kind of focus modern people usually reserve for assembling flat-pack furniture or rage-reading comment sections. Vikings carved everything: spoons, combs, bowls, the sides of ships, the handles of axes, the backs of benches, and, when feeling particularly inspired, the bones of large fish. The aesthetic was generally moody swirls and runes, with occasional appearances by dragons, mythical beasts, or deeply disapproving owls. It passed the time, quieted the nerves, and gave one something to focus on while ignoring the goat chewing on your tunic hem. And if you weren't carving, you were reciting sagas, or at least listening to someone else who claimed to remember them correctly this time. Sagas were the Viking version of evening TV, except the plot was longer, bloodier, and usually featured your uncle's cousin's great-grandfather as a heroic figure who definitely didn't cry during that fjord duel. These tales were orally passed down with impressive flair, often performed near the hearth with dramatic pauses and the occasional eyebrow waggle. Some versions were deeply poetic. Others may have just been excuses for the storyteller to drink more mead while listing who stabbed whom and with what type of spear. Then there was boat repair, because there's always boat repair. You'd think that once a ship was built, it would behave and stay ship-shaped. But no, planks warped, sails tore, oars vanished mysteriously, often repurposed as firewood. And so, Vikings spent a good portion of their free time hammering, sealing, sanding, and muttering about kelp damage. This was done with a look of deep concentration and mild resentment, as though the boat had personally insulted them and they were trying to forgive it one splinter at a time. There were also games, rough hand-carved board games with names lost to time and rules that changed depending on who was losing. These were the precursors to chess, checkers, and the ancient Scandinavian pastime of passive-aggressively accusing your opponent of cheating while pretending not to care. And if none of that appealed, you could always knit. Yes, knit. Wool needed spinning, socks needed darning. Not everything could be made of chainmail, no matter how determined the fashion statement. And sitting by the hearth, slowly looping yarn into vaguely foot-shaped tubes, was a good way to stay warm and look busy when someone was assigning firewood chopping duty. Some practiced magic, or at least muttered to herbs and stared meaningfully at smoke while everyone else avoided eye contact. Others went bird hunting. Some told riddles. Some wrote runes in places they shouldn't. One particularly idle soul probably invented the concept of alphabetizing their mead jugs. But regardless of how you passed the time, there was always a sense that the lull was temporary, that winter would end, that ships would sail, that enemies would eventually need terrifying, and so even leisure carried the soft thrum of anticipation, like the low murmur of oars before the storm. And with that, we stretch into another chapter of Viking life, a topic near and dear to their hearts, stomachs, and occasional spleens. Feasting. Because after all that carving, chanting, and reluctantly corking the hull for the third time this month, you'd earned something more substantial than salted herring and passive resentment. You'd earned a celebration, one that involved more meat than manners. That noble, wind-swept institution where justice was served tepid in a meadow by men wearing too much wool and not enough humility, while other civilizations built marble courts and codified statutes into scrolls. The Norse went with something a little more atmospheric. Picture this. You're standing on a grassy plain in Iceland, surrounded by equally disgruntled neighbours, the scent of damp sheep in the air, and someone's cousin loudly describing a land dispute involving an old fence, a stubborn goat, and possibly a mild stabbing. Welcome to the Althing, the oldest surviving parliament in the world, and also the only one where attendees frequently packed smoked trout and passive aggression. Held once a year because that was about all anyone could tolerate. The Althing was less courtroom drama and more family reunion meets controlled chaos. Chieftains, free men, and occasional troublemakers would assemble in a valley conveniently chosen because it had decent acoustics and a reasonable number of flat rocks to shout from. Laws were recited aloud because literacy was considered optional and parchment didn't like the weather. If you wanted to make a legal argument, you had to shout it loud enough for people 3 sheep lengths away to hear over the wind and the guy roasting fish behind you. The most important man there wasn't a judge or even a chieftain. It was the law speaker. His job was to memorize every law and recite a third of them each year on a rotating schedule. Meaning, if you were accused of something mildly illegal and unlucky enough to have it fall in the third not being recited this year, well, you might just get another 12 months of freedom. Legal loopholes, Viking edition. Disputes could range from the minor, his sheep keeps looking at my wife, to the melodramatic, he burned down my longhouse, insulted my lineage, and borrowed my axe without asking. Punishments were often creative. Fines were popular, as was outlawry, which sounds dramatic because it was. You were literally declared outside the law, no legal protection, no social status, no welcome at the mead table. Basically, a walking suggestion for recreational violence. Sometimes it was temporary, 3 years of awkward camping. Sometimes it was permanent. Bring a map, and never come back. For lesser offences, like borrowing a cloak and forgetting to return it for 7 winters, penalties could include public shaming, loss of livestock, or being made to host someone you hated for an entire fortnight. A fate worse than exile, depending on how loudly they snored. Naturally, this field-based justice system came with its own etiquette. Shouting too early, interrupting the law speaker, or starting a sword fight mid-proceeding were all considered poor form. That didn't stop them, but it was frowned upon. Witnesses were bribed with dried cod, and oaths were sworn on Thor's hammer, or particularly large rocks. If emotions ran high, duel challenges could be issued, though by the later medieval period people mostly preferred to sulk and write insulting poetry instead. And then there were the thing men, the bodyguards of chieftains who attended the Althing to ensure order, which in practice meant glaring at each other and occasionally tossing someone into a ditch for dramatic effect. If justice wasn't found, it was at least thoroughly argued about while cold and slightly damp. After days of arguing, declaring, muttering, and occasionally exiling one's uncle, the thing would end. People would pack up their tents, their grudges, and their leftover salmon and make the long trek back to their fjords. Until next year, when someone's fence would mysteriously move 2 feet west and the whole process would begin again. Which brings us, quite naturally, to what Vikings did when disputes couldn't be settled peacefully, or at least not before someone's axe hand started twitching. Yes, duels, vendettas, and the highly formal art of expressing your feelings with sharpened steel. Not every Viking could be a chieftain, a shipbuilder, or a warrior poet composing mildly threatening verses about the neighbours. Some souls, many in fact, found themselves consigned to more humble, less glamorous roles. Roles that lacked the sweeping narrative appeal of storming foreign coasts, but were nonetheless essential to the everyday function of the community, and entirely unenviable. Let's start softly with the fine art of sheep counting. You might imagine this as a peaceful rural pursuit, a lone figure strolling through misty pastures, woolly shapes emerging through the fog like fluffy ghosts of mild economic importance. But no, Viking sheep, much like Viking humans, were opinionated and uncooperative. They did not line up obediently to be tallied. They wandered, climbed, and on occasion leapt dramatically from rocky outcrops simply to complicate matters. And yet, sheep counting had to be done, not once, but multiple times a year. Taxes, trade obligations, and legal disputes often hinged upon exactly how many sheep a man claimed to own. If he claimed more than he could prove, the Althing might require witnesses, who would, in turn, need to count the sheep themselves, leading to long afternoons of cold toes, exasperation, and occasional sheep-related injuries. Worse still were winter counts, when daylight was brief and storms were common. Counting by torchlight was a special form of torment. Try distinguishing one damp, soot-flecked sheep from another in the flickering shadows, while icy rain slips down your collar and a belligerent ram eyes your knee with malicious intent. If you were fortunate, sheep counting only resulted in a mild chill and temporary disdain for livestock. If you were less fortunate, you might also have to pull double duty as the village tooth puller. Now, to be clear, the Vikings did not have professional dentists. What they had were those unfortunate enough to be deemed handy with tools, or, even worse, simply present when a toothache grew unbearable. In a world of gritty bread, absent dental hygiene, and no small amount of facial trauma, tooth pain was a frequent visitor. When it could no longer be ignored, extraction was the only recourse. The equipment, a variety of tongs, pliers, and whatever implement looked vaguely suitable. Often these were borrowed from blacksmiths, carpenters, or the kitchen. Sanitation was conceptual. Illumination was by torchlight or smoky oil lamps, adding the pleasant ambience of choking fumes to the proceedings. The patient would sit on a bench or the floor, while strong relatives held them still, and the appointed extractor would commence a delicate process involving leverage, muttered apologies, and quite a lot of hope. Success was measured by the removal of the tooth, ideally with minimal jaw damage. Failure was memorable. It was not uncommon for multiple sessions to be required. Anesthetic, of course, consisted of fermented beverages and determination, and should infection follow, well, at least you no longer had to worry about counting sheep. Thus, in the dim light of the longhouse, with the aroma of singed wool and damp earth all around, one could contemplate the peculiar justice of Norse society. While some warriors returned from raids with silver and song, others remained behind, plucking stubborn molars by firelight and trying not to count how many teeth had been lost that month alone. And so we drift, somewhat uneasily, toward other necessary but uncelebrated professions. For in every Viking community, certain tasks had to be done, tasks that no one truly volunteered for, but which were met with stoic resignation. Chief among these, managing the midden heap, the foul and fragrant heart of village waste disposal. But that is a tale we will amble toward, quietly. Love, as with most things in the Viking world, was not so much a matter of sweeping romantic gestures as it was a tangle of practicality, social expectation, and the occasional extremely public argument. Marriage was, first and foremost, an alliance, a contract between families rather than a fairy tale conclusion for two love-struck young people who had accidentally bumped elbows while gathering mead. Dowries were negotiated, cattle were tallied, and gifts were exchanged with much ceremony and the faint air of polite tension. Love, if it happened at all, was a bonus, but not strictly necessary. Viking women, contrary to many grim popular depictions, had more autonomy than one might expect. A married woman managed the household, owned property, and had certain legal rights, including, most interestingly, the right to initiate a divorce. Should things turn sour, perhaps because a husband had returned from raiding with more fleas than treasure, or because his poetry about the neighbour's goats had gone a little too far, a wife could take matters into her own hands. The procedure was both simple and magnificently public. At the entrance of the longhouse, before witnesses, the wife would recite a ritual formula declaring her intent to leave. It typically involved listing her grievances, often loudly, which might include neglect, violence, or the failure to provide proper clothing. She would then pack her belongings and move back to her family's homestead. No lengthy court battle, no drawn-out affair, simply words, witnesses, and decisive action. Naturally, the neighbours would whisper for weeks afterward, dissecting every detail. But from a legal standpoint, the matter was closed. The couple's respective families would renegotiate dowry arrangements and property divisions, while the former spouses adjusted to their new lives. It is perhaps comforting to imagine that somewhere in the cool northern twilight, a newly single Viking woman might sit by the hearth, sip a well-earned cup of ale, and reflect with grim satisfaction on her choice. Meanwhile, her ex-husband might be composing a very bad saga verse about lost love and the tragic misplacement of his good tunic. From matters of the heart to matters of health, life in a Viking settlement was never dull. And speaking of dull, or rather not dull enough, there remains the curious and necessary role of the blade sharpener, without whom neither warrior nor cook could proceed effectively. But we will turn to that softly in due course.